Hi everyone, Sebastian Reynolds here, and this is podcast number 4. It's been super exciting launching this and already at the 4th one. Just today released the 3rd one with Marcus Corbett. Super exciting hearing about his time and work in India, working with Indian musicians there. So please check that out if you haven't already. And for this one, I'm speaking to the wonderful Bróna McVittie. Bróna is a songwriter, multi-instrumentalist, incredibly talented singer and songwriter, composer, and she's from Northern Ireland, and in her work she mixes up between her own compositions and then singing traditional Irish songs, so in the most sort of wonderful and evocative way, mixing electronics, harp, voice, and please check her out, brónamcvittie.com, and I hope you really enjoy the chat, and I'll see you again soon. Hello, Bróna. Nice to see you. How are you?
Hi, Seb. I'm fine. Thank you very much.
Good. So it's just to get things moving, just to start things up. Could you just give us a bit of background on yourself as a musician, and just assume no knowledge from the people listening. Just introduce yourself. Who are you? What do you do?
Sure. So my name is Bróna McVittie. I live in a little village where the mountains of Mourne sweep down to the sea, and I'm a singer-songwriter. I dabble with various instruments, my main instrument being vocals, but I also like to use harp and guitar, and I use some electronics. And as a solo artist, I have released 2 albums now, the first one in 2018, which was called We Are the Wildlife, and the second just last year in September 2020, and that's The Man in the Mountain.
Cool. Sorry, it's cutting out a little bit, but no, thank you for that. So, okay, so obviously you've been a solo artist for a few years now, and before that you were involved in various other projects. Do you want to give a bit more of detail about the projects that you were working on before that, and how you sort of got into music when you were younger as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, going back to my early years, I think music was just something that I always loved. And so first thing I would have done would have been singing along to my parents' records. Mum's records were slightly more interesting than Dad's. And she had things like King Crimson in the Court of the Crimson King, whereas Dad's were more like Frank Sinatra and Elvis. But I did a fair bit of singing along to Dolly Parton, Judy Collins. And when I was 9 years old, I took up clarinet. So our local educational authority here handed out woodwind instruments to children in state education. And I think I was the only one in the school who could blow the clarinet. So that was my first instrument, and I sort of took that through to grade 5. And I went to local comprehensive school in Newry High. So unfortunately, they didn't have music. So it wasn't something I was able to pursue there, although I kept going to the clarinet lessons. And I was part of the South Ulster Youth Band. So it was a woodwind band, and we used to meet in Portadown. You used to have to get up at 7 o'clock on a Saturday morning and go and play. That was what you had to do to get your instrument on loan. So then music didn't really play a big part in my life until later. Maybe I was 18, 19, and I was inspired by a then boyfriend who wrote me a love song. And I thought, oh gosh, isn't this just fantastic what you can do, and the way that, you can make people feel, and all you need is a guitar. And so I went to South America. I did a little bit of VSO, teaching English in schools in Ecuador, doing some voluntary work over there. I did a bit of traveling afterwards, and I bought my first guitar in La Paz in Bolivia. And I've still got it. It hangs on the wall at my mum's house, and it's a pretty beat up old thing, but it was enough to get me started. And that's really where I started writing songs. I then lived in Oxford, where I studied for a few years. I actually did biology, not music, but I've always done music on the side. So I joined several choirs, and I kept up. I started writing songs then, I suppose, when I was 19, 20. And I've been trying to get better at it ever since. But various different projects. When I went down to London, I joined up a traditional 6-piece trad band, Irish traditional music. It was really through the London Irish scene, and I took up with them. They asked me to be their lead singer, and by that time I had also taken up harp. A friend of mine, Keith Beachy, who made harps in London, North London, I borrowed a harp off him when I was recording an album way back, 2008 I think it was released. It was under the moniker Forest Brook, and that was me and a few musical friends. And I borrowed the harp because I wanted to record harp for this album. And then I just fell in love with the instrument and have really been largely self-taught on the guitar and the harp. And after various different projects and also working part-time alongside that, I decided to ditch the day job, moved back to County Down from London, and that's when I started working on my current solo project. So that's probably enough background.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, it's great. It's great to hear it all.
My life story in a nutshell.
Yeah, I love it. That's why we're here. So, because what I wanted to, and I think that sort of sets the scene really nicely for talking about the music which you make, which I think is absolutely beautiful. Like, it's really, really wonderful stuff. I had a listen through actually both albums back to back yesterday just to sort of refresh it in my mind. And maybe we should let the people listening at home know that we met through a mutual friend, Connor, wasn't it, in Cork?
That's right.
And I've been your publicist for the last couple of years and helped to promote both of the albums. So that was kind of our starting point together. But and also seeing you play live, and we played a gig together in Oxford and so on. But yeah, I feel like I've been sort of reflecting back over the music and the two albums, and I think what I really love about the records and about what you do is there's a lot of diversity in it. So there's a mixture of original songs, like you said, you've been songwriting for a long time, but then there's also this rich vein of traditional Irish folk songs, some of which are actually specifically from the area where you're from. So it's very localized. And then you talk about as we talked about when we've been promoting the releases, this element of what you call kind of psychogeography and what it was like when you were living in Leighton in London and how that sort of inspired you as well. So there's all these different geographical aspects, you could say, in a way, but and personal aspects as well, sort of biographies. And then the channeling of the Irish folk tradition and lots of literary references to Greek mythology and so on, and lots of musical sort of devices, so with the harp and acoustic guitar and vocal that's very much inspired by choral music and folk music, but then electronics and some of the different collaborators you've worked with. What I find so interesting is how there are all these really fascinating threads, but that it's such a beautifully kind of cohesive whole. So there's obviously variety and there's character in the different tracks, but there's also a real kind of continuity to the way that it's put together. And it's clear that you've spent a lot of time meticulously crafting how it's put together as well. So, sorry, there's a lot for you to respond to in what I've just said, but are you sort of conscious in the way that you're composing and putting tracks together, like in terms of choosing the folk songs and then writing? Like, what's your kind of process? Is there, or do you want to pick on some tracks or one of the albums in particular? Like, what's your process is what I'm asking, I think.
I suppose, as you quite rightly point out, moving back to County Down was a Kickstarter for me to spend a lot more time, researching the singing tradition in Ulster here. And I hadn't realised that there was such a wealth of traditional song, mainly when I was singing with the London Lasses in London, which was over actually a 10-year period. We did, traditional Irish songs, but they weren't really, none of them, as far as I recall, were from the north. So it was really nice to sort of dip into the folk heritage here. And also as part of that, I took on a leadership role with a local community singing group. And that gave me a great opportunity to arrange songs from the local area for singers. So that kind of helped me then to develop an idea for what I was going to do with the solo project. And because I love traditional folk so much and I love arranging songs, and for me, I suppose in terms of process, it's, how can you take a song, a ballad that's, been sung in a certain way, perhaps it's just been sung unaccompanied, as a lot of the singing circles here in Ulster would just have, people would sing unaccompanied, or they might use a guitar. But I suppose my interest is really, how can you take something from the tradition and really give it a new skin? And I suppose that's where dabbling in electronics is something that I've found to be very rewarding in terms of, and also using different musical structures. So, instead of using a G and a D and an A chord, as someone might for a traditional folk song, it's like, how can you actually chordally kind of mutate the thing, and have it still work? So largely I would keep the melodies intact, but I very much stretch time signature and phrasing, just, I suppose, exploring how it's possible to bring new meaning to a song, and also, you're bringing it into the context of the present day as well. We have so many different tools available to us now as composers and music makers that just, it's like you're a kid in a sweet shop and there's just endless possibilities. And I just find, for me, that it's just something I just love doing. So that's really where I'm coming from with the traditional stuff. But I didn't want to solely focus on traditional folk music because, as you quite rightly observed, I love writing songs too. So I thought, well, it's a bit of a risk because, in terms of audience, people might expect you to do one or the other. And I've kind of tried to do a little bit of both and then didn't really know how it would be received. And I think with your help, it's gone down well. People have enjoy the traditional songs on the albums, and also the self-penned songs. And I don't think I really have a process. I mean, it varies from song to song. There are certain songs that come in their entirety with lyric and melody, and other songs that come in fragments or start off from fragments that become, developed into something more elaborate. So it's really very different, I find, for songs that I've written myself, the process. And I think as well, I'm one of those people who I find it very difficult to stick to the rules. Like if I'm cooking, I'll have a recipe there and I'll never ever follow the recipe, but I'll just say, oh, I like the sound of that, and I'll have a bit of that. And then, oh, I'm going to do it this way. And I think that's the fun aspect of creating something is the spontaneity in it. And you almost don't know how you're going to do it until you get started. And so for me, it's like a little adventure, and I don't know what I'm going to discover on the way. But if I'm having fun, and then if I'm able to produce something at the end of it that people like, that people enjoy listening to, and that brings people some kind of happiness. And I mean, I just love getting feedback from people who've bought the albums. I got the most wonderful little note in the post the other day from someone who had bought The Man in the Mountain recently, and he was just saying how often he was listening to it, and I was just so touched by that he had been compelled to put pen to paper and go the old-fashioned way of sending a letter rather than just sending an email. And so little things like that just really, that they help you and encourage you to go forward, to keep going. And
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's a few different things that came to mind when you were talking, and I think one of the questions I had was related specifically to the traditional folk songs and the ones that you've chosen, certainly for these two albums. I mean, is there an element of almost like a theatre element to it, where you're almost the way that you identify with the protagonist of the song? So not that it's sort of crudely autobiographic in that way, but there is an element of the way that you relate to the character or the narrative of the story. Is that at play? Maybe it's more subconscious than conscious, but are you aware of why you would choose, or is it more their symbolic meaning, like The Man in the Mountain or whatever? Like, do you see what I mean? Is there, how are you choosing the traditional songs?
Well, I'm usually spoilt for choice and have more options than I'm able to realize and develop into, fully blown pieces, compositions. I think I tend to. I've actually done some of the stuff on We Are the Wildlife was folk songs that were new to me from learning them from the Ulster tradition. And melody is a big factor in why I'd chosen some of those songs rather than the narrative. I think as you're learning to sing a song, you're almost developing your own narrative. And that's for me where I would, choose to phrase something vocally in a different way. The narrative kind of comes out of it then. And I think you can find different meanings, particularly when it comes to the lyrics of folk songs. But in terms of some of the other songs that I have chosen to produce are actually songs that I've been singing for years and years. And I know them so well, but I want to do something completely different with them. But it tends to be actually I'm very driven by melody when it comes to choosing a folk song. It's just something that it speaks to me beyond the lyrics, and almost in many ways seems more important than the lyrics. Okay. I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Yeah, no, fair enough. And thinking about the the success that you've had and the way that your music is traveling all over the world, do you feel that you're in a position now where you're almost like an ambassador on behalf of your culture Do you have a sense of responsibility in that way?
I think I definitely want to be an ambassador for my country, and particularly because Northern Ireland isn't perceived by people who haven't had the chance to visit here. It's not really perceived as a place that you would go, for a wonderful cultural experience. People tend to think still of the Troubles when they think of Northern Ireland.
Yeah, of course.
And a lot of that awareness will have been generated by the media. But so I do feel quite strongly that I want to engage people in our folklore and heritage, as a way to kind of combat that almost. For me, growing up here as a child in the Troubles, I experienced the effect of segregation, societal segregation. So you go to school and, it's either you're in a class full of Catholic children or Protestant children. Now, it's much, much different than that now because we have integrated schools, Catholic and Protestant children going to school together. But there was a lot of oppression, societal oppression that came from the Troubles, people being afraid to express themselves freely. And I think that particularly affects artists and people who have an artistic temperament. I was quite keen, as a young person to leave. And now I'm really happy to be here again. So it's kind of, I'm coming full circle almost in a way now, by being here and trying to channel some of the positive now so that if somebody from Kazakhstan happens to listen to a song and think, oh, there's a nice folk song. Where is that from? Oh, it's from Northern Ireland. Oh, I didn't know they did folk in Northern Ireland, because people think of it as being largely something associated with Ireland. And I think English folk music has the same issue, although we've had a wonderful resurgence in the past decade, with groups like Bellowhead and the like, really innovating in the tradition there and really generating a new following of younger people for English folk music. But I think looking back, English folk music has been, perhaps a little bit eclipsed by the Irish folk tradition. And probably that's kind of similar as well in Northern Ireland. It's like, people just think, oh yeah, that's the place where they had the Troubles.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I completely hear what you're saying. I think we should probably give a shout out to our friend Sam Lee as well at this point, in terms of doing an interesting job of popularising or bringing a new contemporary perspective on English folk and British folk music.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. Sam started the Magpie's Nest Folk Club in London, and that would have been at least 10, 15 years ago. And it was all about bringing, folk to younger audiences, because, in folk clubs, it was very much the stereotype, but also true, that most of the people had grey hair and beards. And, well, apart from the women, maybe some of the women had beards too. But so Sam and Joe Bursky started the Magpie's Nest Folk Club in London, and his present initiative, the Nest Collective, which has gone on from strength to strength, grew out of that folk club. So he has done great work in popularising the English folk songs, particularly in his solo work, definitely.
Yeah, and also he's been involved in some of the really big song collecting initiatives as well, hasn't he?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I think he is lecturer. I'm not sure if he still lectures on a course that's linked to the Sage Gateshead. It's one of only 2 or 3, a handful of courses, degrees where you can actually study folk music for a degree. I know there's some there over in the west of Ireland as well. But yeah, it's pretty amazing thinking about that evolution from traditional folk, which was really just carried down by word of mouth, and also, kind of thinking of peasant farmers in fields and going home playing instruments at the end of a long, hard day, working, in the fields, to now being something that you can actually go to university and study no matter where you're from.
Yeah, I was going to mention as well, there's something I was going to come on to ask you was, just for people listening who might not know, it would be quite interesting to hear just how much sort of regional variation there is across like Ireland, as in Ireland, the island, right? So geographically, like how much variation there is in terms of language and dialects, and also in the sort of musical traditions as well, because it's a fairly small place. But I remember I used to go out with a Russian girl, and I'm trying to fact check this at the moment, but from what I remember, from what Tasha told me, is that in Russia, and this is amazing considering what a huge place it is, there's relatively small regional variation in terms of accents and dialects and so on, but I'm trying to check that out. So if someone listening knows their stuff about Russia, get in touch and tell me, because I want to know more about that point. But I think that certainly in terms of these small areas like England, Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, and then Ireland, there's so much variation. Just in England, there's so much variation in terms of accents, essentially, in language. And then in Ireland, is there a lot of variation from north to south, or?
Yeah, if you go just even 6 miles down the road from here to fishing village, Kilkeel, you would swear you were in Scotland. You listen to the accents, and you'll find that as well going on up into the North Antrim coast area, that the accents are very, very strong, very similar to the Scottish brogue. Whereas if you go down to Cork, you can't understand what anybody's talking about at all. I just think they're talking a foreign language, we have huge amount of regional variation. How did that evolve? Now, that's an interesting question.
Maybe that's probably its own podcast, isn't it? That's something
I think so.
Probably can't get into that much detail right now. I need to give you a bit of notice.
Yeah.
In
terms of, just sort of picking up on that point, in terms of actually, one thing I can tell you about a little bit is that with the Gaelic language, which is only spoken now in pockets of areas, that there is vast difference in the dialects, and actually that the Irish that they speak in Ulster, and actually the most of it is spoken over in Donegal, but there are some Gaeltachts over here on the east side. It's more similar to the Scots Gaelic, or Scots Gaelic as they call it, than it is to the Munster Irish, which is spoken down along the west coast down to Cork, from County Kerry, Clare. And I think that because it's only been spoken in pockets, it's evolved to become more different more quickly over time. So the Irish speakers in Donegal haven't a clue what the Munster Irish guys are going on about. The accent and the dialect is so different. So there you go.
Fascinating. Fascinating. Thank you for sharing. How is it when you tour and you play around Ireland with that in mind, with there being so much sort of variation from area to area? What are the reactions like when you play live? Like, has anyone said anything particularly strange or unusual to you, or just loved it, or like what how do people vibe off it, what you're doing?
Well, I haven't really done that much touring in Ireland, to be honest with you, but I have played in Ireland and toured here with the London Lasses, and every time I sang a traditional folk song and introduced it with a story, as what I would know about the folk song. Somebody would come up to me afterwards and say, "Oh, but that actually came from here, not there." And so you would end up, people would tell you, stuff that you didn't know, or if you said something and it wasn't right, oh, it was from this area. No, it wasn't that area. It was 3 miles down the road over there. So, that's quite fun actually. But in terms of my own solo project, I've not yet had the opportunity to take it too widely. I've performed in Dublin several times, but when we get out of lockdowns, I definitely want to get out and about, with the music and travel more widely with it.
Okay, so and in Dublin itself, was that? I suppose it's a relatively kind of cosmopolitan type place, so they're used to hearing people from all over the place anyway. So there wasn't.
Well, I had the pleasure of performing in the National Concert Hall, and that was quite an interesting concert because I was playing in support of an Armenian pianist, and his work probably falls very much within a sort of cross-genre, classical, and sort of experimental jazz kind of thing. And so I think having me singing traditional folk songs, but in a weird way, as the support act, people were, I think, a little bit surprised. But I had a lot of really positive feedback when I went out onto the floor after we'd performed, and people who are from Dublin, they were very positive about it. But then We Are the Wildlife, I did a mixture of songs, not just songs from Ulster. So so people have different reference points then.
Okay, and maybe it would be nice to move on and maybe talk a little bit about the various collaborators that you've worked with across the two albums. Obviously, there's Isan and Miles Cochrane is involved, Richard Curran, the cellist. Maybe, just talk about these guys that you've worked with and how those relationships came about.
I've been very blessed, really, to have the kind of musical collaboration that I've had across both of the albums. And there are people who I worked with on the first album, such as Miles and Richard and Anne Garner, who plays flute, Hutch Demwilpier, who plays trumpet. They are sort of longer term musical collaborators, people I've known for a few years. Isan I've known for a few years as well, actually, although I've never toyed with the idea of a musical collaboration with them. So that was completely new for the second album, The Man in the Mountain. And I just thought, why don't I try, on the second album, rather than doing all the electronics and everything myself, why don't I invite artists who are working in that genre to respond to what I'm doing musically. And so I didn't really know how it would work out, but it was really, it really opened my eyes as to what's possible through collaboration that you can't achieve by yourself. And even though obviously it's my solo project, I think that the sort of where I've been able to take it with the help of those people, with the help of those artists, has just kind of blown me away, and Arve Henriksen, who I met at the National Concert Hall in Dublin because he was on stage with Tigran Hamasyan, the Armenian pianist that I just mentioned. He just said, "Oh, that's lovely, great set, love it." And then they came on and they did really it was just phenomenal what they did. And they did some Armenian folk. They kind of were messing around with a few traditional Armenian folk songs. And also, Arve also is quite influenced by Japanese culture. And afterwards, I just got chatting to him and I said, "Oh, have you ever worked on a traditional Irish song?" And he said, "No." So I followed up with him and I said, "I'm recording my second album and I wonder if you would consider working with me." And I was fully expecting there to be no response at all. And when he replied saying that, he'd like to do it, I was just really excited. So I think I've been able to take the music somewhere different in the second album. The first album, I think a lot of the arrangements I already had in my head. Richard Curran, who plays the cello, violin and viola, I was kind of sketching out parts, and he was playing those parts. So that's kind of different in a way. But I just leave it up to the musicians. Some musicians want you to say, do this, and other musicians need to be given a carte blanche. Like Hutch Demwilpier, when it comes to her trumpet work, she's just so experimental that you have to just let her do what she's going to do, and I love that as well, because you never know what you're going to get back when you send it down the pipes. So,
and another kind of collaborator that you've worked with is another mutual friend of ours, Adam Hale, and you've made some really beautiful video material with him. Do you want to talk a little bit about that relationship and how you've developed a kind of visual narrative, a visual aesthetic for your work?
I really enjoyed working with Adam. I came along thinking that I had to kind of have a script or something in mind. And he was so much more relaxed about the process. And in terms of narrative development, I would sort of suggest things to him and we would sort of fire off each other, but it was a very spontaneous process. And I think that very much suits me as well, because I just think, then you get the opportunity to have some kind of discovery that you wouldn't otherwise have if you were sticking strictly to a script. But I absolutely love his work. And yeah, I've done 2 videos with him, actually, for the single for the first album, Under the Pines, and the single for the second album, The Green Man. And I hope that we'll be able to work together again in the future, once we get out of lockdowns. Because he's a great guy. Yeah, he's really cool.
Yeah, good. I think that sort of, like you've referenced it a couple of times now, and something that I feel is really important in my creative practice is having that, trying to always keep that spirit of fun and not. I feel like I do a lot of my best work when I'm just I'll be sat on the sofa with Adrienne watching Kirsty and Phil or whatever, and I'll just have my headphones on and just be sort of playing. Like, I don't feel like I'm working. There's no right, I'm going to sit down and make my masterpiece. It's like, I just got some sounds and I can just sit here with my headphones and play around. And I think a lot of artists have that sort of childlike wonder almost for the world that they're looking to kind of channel. And it's really interesting to hear that you have that with Adam as well, where you could be exploratory and playful. And we made a music video for my track, Holy Island, with Aoi Nakamura, the dancer, wonderful Japanese dancer, and Adrienne was directing her. And there's, we went out, scouted locations, but there was a lot of play that was done on location. There's not so much you could plan in advance. So yeah, I can really relate to that. I was going to move on and bring in a slightly different angle. Now, as you say, you studied biology at Oxford, and I was looking back over our old press releases, and I've reminded myself about the Falling for Icarus, which I'll quote from the press release. Original sun-worshipping anthem Falling for Icarus, which adopts nuclear fusion as a metaphor for love. So maybe I put that in there more than you, but I was just interested, and we talked about the psychogeography, and I've heard you talk before about this sort of inspiration from science and biology. Do you have anything to say in particular about how that sort of aspect of your character and your life experience sort of informs what you do?
I think as a because I trained in science, and probably just actually very much part of my nature, biology anyway, and science in general, is an attempt to describe how something works. So a mechanism, or it's not really so much about why, or finding kind of hard and fast answers. There are people who spend decades working on just one biochemical pathway and identifying all of the different components. And it's so kind of, abstract in many senses. I actually used to work, so one of my day jobs was as a science communicator, and that job involved trying to translate complex jargon into something that was more intelligible for, people who don't have a scientific background to understand. And I think one of the things I really enjoyed doing as part of that work was just describing in simple words, what maybe it's describing what something looks like. So for example, with my single for the second album, The Green Man, I'm simply sitting at my kitchen table and I'm looking out the window, and I can just see these trees, and they're just sort of intertwined in such a way that this sycamore tree has there's a head, and it's like the head of a green man, and he is totally like the green giant off the the sweet corn tin. And then the arms are just this ash tree sort of coming through it. And so when I say I see you through the window, your arms are made from ash, your moy is sycamore. Moy is just a Scottish word for face. I'm literally just describing what I'm looking at. So in a way, I think that is actually very scientific, even though if you listen to the lyrics, I think it sounds like some kind of deep, mystic kind of revelation.
Interesting.
I think it's more the musical setting that gives it that sense. So yeah, I would say that's very much how science influences my writing. And actually that song, Falling for Icarus, it's an interesting case because back when I was working on under the moniker of Forest Brook on my first album, that song was supposed to go on there in 2008. So, and then I also had it lined up to go on the We Are the Wildlife album. But it just wasn't ready. I just didn't like the instrumentation. It didn't feel right. So I stripped all of the instruments out that I had recorded, and it was a lot of stuff. And I just sent the vocals to Isan, to Robin and Anthony, and I said, look, just see what you can do with this. And they just came back with this fantastic electronic instrumentation that it just really worked. And so I was delighted to finally have this song arrive at its, at its kind of ripeness, if you like. So I'm really happy with that song now.
Yeah, well, it's beautiful. So you've done something right.
You.
So another sort of aspect or sort of thread that I'd like to pick up on is the more kind of mundane influences, one could say, in a way. So sort of music, aside from the traditional folk music that we've talked about in detail, are there other particular inspirations? I think we've mentioned people like Boards of Canada and Colleen and all these sorts of people, Portishead, that from a more of an atmospheric electronic or almost slightly trip-hoppy kind of vein. And then, you've said that you loved John Martin and Bert Jansch and all these guys as well. You mentioned Dolly Parton, which is interesting. I mean, sometimes the process of doing PR and my role in terms of the publicist is it's complicated because there is something about selling and trying to position an artist amongst other artists where when a radio person or a journalist or a blogger listens to something, you want to give them some leads. You want to give them some, because people copy and paste as well. And I know that for myself as an artist, I listen to all sorts of crazy stuff that has nothing to do with the music that I actually make aesthetically. Like, I love Hank Williams. I've been on a massive Hank Williams tip at the moment, but it's got nothing to do with the sort of music I'm making and releasing. And it wouldn't make sense to put it in a press release. But there's something about it that's quite abstract, but I find inspirational. So for you, is it Dolly Parton? Is she the one? Is there any artists in particular who might be a surprise to listeners to hear? Oh, actually, and you mentioned King Crimson, great band. That's a great album.
Yeah, I mean, I think for musicians, and I'm sure, like, just as you said yourself there, what you listen to is not necessarily what you're going to produce, or you don't produce something that's necessarily like something that you love and admire in someone else. Because I suppose being a musician and being a creator and producer, it's about finding your own voice, isn't it? And so, like, you have to play and experiment a lot. And I find listening very broadly, and I have to say, I mean, I shouldn't really, but I use Spotify a lot to discover new music. So I'm less buying physical products now than I used to in the past. I've got such a vast, boxes of CDs and records, and now I go to my Discover Weekly on a Monday, and I'm really excited to listen to someone I've never heard before, but I'm going to go, I love that, and I've been training my bot now for a while. So, because I always say, oh, I like that, I like that, I like that. So, I build up my library, and then, it gives me more of what it thinks is similar. And on the whole, that actually means that I'm discovering music now that I think I wouldn't have necessarily been able to listen to. But I mean, there are so many different influences on my work. I think possibly the greatest influence on my work is actually silence, because I spend a lot of time in silence, and I really value that silence. And I feel that if I've got too much like oral clutter, it actually interrupts. If I'm working on something, for example, I will tend to find that I'll need to actually spend several hours of the day actually with no audio. So, and in a way, as the greater influence than music itself or listening to other artists and music is actually very much, coming back to that sort of psychogeographic thing. I'm blessed to live in a rural location, and for me, being moved by the feeling that I have when I'm out in the wilds, just this feeling of freedom and just this great joy, that's what I try to put into my music. So yeah, in terms of influence, actually it's less that you're influenced by other artists so much as just being inspired by, something as simple as going for a walk.
Yeah. No. I completely hear you on that. It's just that sometimes if you're trying to get the BBC to play your track, you can't just put silence on the press release.
Yeah, John Cage.
Yeah, exactly. No, yeah. It's fascinating, because this is, I think, almost... Certainly with Simon, who I spoke to recently, Simon McCurry, the cellist, he has a great track called The Nothing That Is. And we had a really interesting conversation about silence. And I've heard it. I mean, Andy Warhol, I've quoted this as well already. Andy Warhol said that he really enjoyed being bored because it was so important for creativity. And I think by bored, he doesn't mean like being restless because you're unoccupied, but more that space of being unstimulated. And actually, I referenced this as well before, but David Lynch, there's a great video. There's some great videos of David Lynch on YouTube just talking and being David Lynch. But there's one where he was saying like ideas are like fish. It's like you're fishing, and that the bigger the fish you want to catch, the more quiet you have to be to allow that process to unfold. And I do meditation and I go running on my own. Like I totally find that space is so valuable, and that if you're distracted permanently, you're not leaving space for something to come up, right?
Totally agree.
I was gonna just mention briefly, maybe as we're wrapping things up here, whether it would be nice to talk about the Mourn Community Choir and your work with them, and maybe it'd be nice to give them a bit of a shout out.
Yeah. So unfortunately, we haven't been able to meet, obviously, with this situation. We actually ceased our meetings before the first lockdown last year. And I have returned to the group on several occasions, hoping to put something together online. But in Northern Ireland here, we're very much we're really technophobes, and we're really crap at online stuff. So there's I think it's just people are so face to face here in their culture that if they can't do it for real, they don't want to do it at all. So but I think when we come back together again, we're going to have this renewed passion, because I only had the opportunity to do one little gig there as a launch for the second album, The Man in the Mountain, back in September. It was a show I'd had in the diary since the start of 2020, and I didn't know if I would actually be able to manage to get over to London to do this show. And when I turned up, I was very honoured to be the first person who to do a show at this the St Pancras Old Church in King's Cross, a gorgeous little venue, and we did a socially distanced gig, and it was really well organised, and it was just such a joy to be on stage with real musicians playing and just sharing this wonderful thing, and the audience as well, because they had been so deprived of being able to go to concerts, were so responsive, and just the whole thing was such a joy. And I know that when I get back to singing with the choir, we're going to have a similar kind of, this is what it's all about, sharing this kind of community sharing of singing. It really is a very precious thing, and I'm very privileged to be able to do that.
Good. Yeah. Can't wait. And so is there anything you can tease us with on the subject of album number 3? Any exclusives we can drop in?
Well, I tell you what, I've been getting really interested in frequency modulation synthesis over the past few months, and I know you work with Ableton Live as well. I did a little course in lockdown, and it just opened my eyes to the possibilities of creating my own sounds. I have a little Volca, it's a Volca synth, FM synth, and it allows you to, it's got a lot of preset sounds, and I've used those, but what I'm trying to do now is actually to create my own sounds by tweaking the algorithms and changing the parameters within that. And it's just blowing my mind. So I'm so excited about, making my own synth sound. So that's kind of the role that I'm on at the moment, and how that'll work itself into the next album, I can't really say at this stage, but It's very exciting.
Okay, good. Yeah. And there's also something we talked about. So there's the remixes from the previous tracks. Maybe one day,
right.
There's no rush. Yeah. We should make people wait, but one day at the right time.
Well, I've had people tweeting at me recently saying, when are you going to put something out on vinyl? And I think that's something that I'd really like to do. I have this idea about having these little 7 inches, and on the one side there'd be the original track, and on the other side there'd be the remix. So yeah, all I need is somebody to come along and say, that's a really good idea, I'll give you some money to do that.
That can be arranged. We'll work that out. Will it work? Someone listening will get involved. But yeah, I think that's everything. That was a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Great. I thought we were going to do like a talk about you had this idea, didn't you, about
oh yeah, let's end on that. Yeah.
Do you want to have a little bit of that? 20th century, 21st century?
Yeah. Shall I just I'll bring that in. That's a really good point. Yeah. So it's something that I talked about with Simon and with Oliver, and I think it's something I'll bring up with all my guests, because it's something I'm really fascinated to learn more about, is this idea that it's a theory or an idea that culture and art, music, whatever, sort of evolved very slowly over millennia, over hundreds of years. And then the 20th century came along and you had this explosion in technology. Before that, there were technological innovations such as the piano and so on. Like, things did change and move, but all those changes happened much slower. And then in the 20th century, suddenly, bang, you had this explosion of technology and the recording means and so on that just completely changed the landscape in terms of how music's made, and also our relationships to it. So it sort of made me think about how, I feel, and I've heard others say as well, that with a composer like Bach, we're still working it out. We're still making sense of what he's offered in terms of processes, and that we've had several Bachs in the 20th century, like Steve Reich and his process, and these people but there's a sort of a negative side to this explosion of technology and possibilities that's made us almost kind of gluttons for innovation, and that we judge art in terms of its sort of technical innovation in a way that's almost kind of unsustainable and unrealistic. And that, like, the counter is that, there are only so many human truths. Like, there is only so much that's different or new in the human experience that you can really express. So it's a sort of erroneous, or I don't know, it's hard to put words around, but you get my point. I'd be interested to hear your perspective on that sort of idea.
You've just reminded me that after I met Brian Eno a few years ago through a mutual friend, and I was chatting to him about music, and one of the things he said to me that really stayed with me, and actually it really upset me at the time, was that music is a spent force. But I think that, what you've just described, I think that's what he was saying was, we've been there, we've done that, we've done everything that we can do. So what more is there to offer? Well, I obviously felt quite sad when he said that, because it sort of made my plight as an artist, the risk of it being a futile endeavor. But I think that there's definitely some. I suppose the thing that we have now, insofar as technology being something that's so available to everyone. I mean, people have a band in a box in their bedroom now, and everyone can make music. And so we have this kind of huge kind of like so many different songs coming out and being sent out into this kind of huge digital space. And it does seem to me that the technology in some ways can be a distraction, but at the same time, if at the heart of what the artist is doing is something that's deeply emotional, deeply spiritual, that's not going to change really, with having new tools to work with. And I think it's a very exciting time musically, but possibly you're right. There's too much focus on technical innovation, or in terms of like, the digital technologies that we use. I mean, I find it fascinating that today, successful artists and take like Matmos for an example, and I absolutely love their work. But they're self-confessed, that they've no training in music at all in terms of composition, and no real understanding of, like, for example, what Bach would have put together from a musical perspective. They're simply fascinated with technology and toys and playing, and they have this basement that's just full of all of these things that they've collected, like half of it's junk, and they just make a noise with whatever junk they've got, and then they just manipulate this noise electronically through a variety of different processes. But I mean, I think, there's no doubt that at the heart of what they're doing is extremely musical, and I find their work very inspiring. But yeah, the fact is, music making today doesn't require someone to have that training necessarily. It simply requires them to have a vision, and the tools to realize their vision are so easily accessible now in terms of affordability. And so there's nothing to stop people, and I think that's a great thing, but it's also a scary thing from the perspective of, where does one fit in to that? But I don't spend too much time worrying about that myself. But
No.
And
you used that same word again, didn't you? Play. The importance of play.
It's definitely something that's more a part of music making today. I wouldn't think. I mean, maybe Bach and Beethoven. I mean, I'm sure they played a lot, but also it seems to me that to write music on a page, on a sheet, to compose, it requires so much of one's like intellect and academic ability, that for some people that's quite difficult to comprehend. How could you do that? How does that work?
I suppose it's that thing about having, whether you're using Ableton Live or whether you're writing music on manuscripts and so on, it's a sort of fluency that you develop. So you learn the rules so you can break them almost. And that these guys they'd write music like they're writing words, like they're writing a shopping list. Like, although obviously the initial process of learning that was a barrier. That wasn't democratic. Like, it was restrictive as to who would get to that point in terms of being able to write music like that. But there was still, and I remember, is it Kadai, the Hungarian composer? Didn't he used to just go and walk around the market and he'd listen to people talking, and that's where he'd get melodies from? It was just hearing people. He'd just go out for a walk and hear people talking. So I think that play has always sort of, I mean, in terms of behavior, like all the brightest animals play. Like, it's a marker of intellect in the animal kingdom, like crows, apes, all the most dolphins. Like, they're very, very playful animals. So there's a link between, like you're saying, with the scientific thing, or whether it's music, that exploratory, that childlike wonder.
Yeah, it's definitely a method of learning and discovery, play. I think that without it, you're quite limited, really. And I suppose that's why it's important for, children to be able to play. And I suppose for us to be reminded of that play, that childlike play, and that we shouldn't ever lose that desire and motivation. Because, it's extremely important. I wonder what Beethoven would do if you gave him a copy of Ableton Live.
Well, Who knows? Let's try and imagine. I was going to say on the FM synthesizer tip. So I don't know if you know, my first ever. Well, I think you could say my first keyboard was a DX27. And that died a death a while ago. But now I still have 2 Yamaha DX21s. So I am certainly a member of the FM club.
You're a synth geek.
A little bit. A
Good.
little bit. Not as much as some people. Admittedly, like, I've never really successfully programmed it, but I've got loads of sounds that... So I was in a band called Keyboard Choir, and the guy I was in the band with, AD, or his nickname was Gandalf, which was rather funny. And he basically was a massive synth nerd, and he programmed all the sounds in it, and I still use them. Thanks a lot, Gandalf. Shout out to Gandalf there.
Class. That's brilliant. I love that.
So, Bróna, anything else for the faithful? Anything else to share before we go offline?
I'd just like to say, for anyone that's actually listened this far, I don't know how edited this will be, but
no editing.
Big love
Pure.
to you. You know, we're going to come out of this very soon, and I hope that you have found some kind of hobby that has helped to keep you sane in lockdown. Some kind of play, some kind of solace. But big love to everybody who has listened, and thank you so much, Seb, for having me.
Pleasure. And one last thing: if people are hearing of you or hearing you for the first time, are there any particular tracks, any videos? I mean, what I'll do is we'll talk about it, and then in the information box on YouTube, I'll share any links. So any particular videos or songs of yours, or obviously your website. Just give us some links.
If anyone's interested, I did attempt to dabble in video a little throughout the first lockdown. And in the run-up to releasing my album in September last year, I put together a short documentary, just really kind of to give people a little glimpse into my world and my inspirations. So that's up on my YouTube if anybody wants to have a goggle.
So, and then your website is? It's
just Bróna, Brona McVittie, McVittie.com.
Cool, and we'll put that link in the box, and obviously from there people can find everything, and all your music is widely available online.
It is. Thank you, Seb.
Pleasure. Thanks very much, Bróna. See you soon.